In this video, we will show you how to replace your front lower control arm on this 2009 Dodge Dakota. This is part of the suspension and it's located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. The first thing you need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so your wheel's off the ground. Once you've done that, continue on to removing all 5 of your 22mm lug nuts and then the wheel. If you have a dust cover, remove that as well. Next, we're going to move along to removing the caliper from this area. But when we do, it's important to make sure that you have something holding the rotor in place. I'll continue on with a spacer and one of my lug nuts to hold the rotor to the wheel bearing. Now we can start removing the caliper. You'll notice for this, you have 2 21mm bolts holding it in place. We'll loosen the top one, leave it in there a couple threads, fully remove the lower one. Inspect all of your hardware as you remove it, replace it as necessary. Now we'll start removing the caliper. When you do, it's important to make sure that you hang it on something so it's putting no pressure on the flex hose. Before we hang it, let's just take a quick peek at those pads. Make sure it looks like they're not worn or damaged in any way. If they are, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace them. Now I'll hang this aside so we can continue. Continue on to your 36mm axle nut. Use a hammer and punch to break the axle free from the wheel bearing. Now that we have the wheel out of the way, let's go ahead and follow our ABS wire coming up the control arm and then all the way up to the wheel well. You can see that you have the tip of the push clip coming through. Use a trim tool and come from the back side of the wheel well here and pry up against the ABS wire. We're going to try to pull this right out of here. Once you have that down, you can bring it down to an area that you can service this. Looking at this area, you can tell that there's a little tab that we can squeeze in and then gently pull this apart. Once we do, we'll give it a quick check for corrosion. This one looks fine. Let's follow the wire down to the upper control arm. To remove this from its locking clip, we'll use a small pocket screwdriver. Come right in between this clip and gently pry this to separate it. Once you have that up, continue on to removing the ABS wire from the clip itself. We'll give that a quick inspection. Now we'll bring this down over to this side. Now let's move along to the upper ball joint nut. In our instance, we have a locking cotter pin and a castle nut. Let's remove that cotter pin and then remove the nut. Use a 21mm socket to remove the mounting nut. We'll leave this on here a couple threads. Now we're going to have to separate the ball joint from the steering knuckle. When you do this, you don't want to use a pickle fork and come in between this area and potentially damage the ball joint or the boot itself. We'll use a little bit of vibration with a hammer to break it free. use a pry bar, come under here, pry down on that upper control arm, remove the nut. Now let's carefully lift this up and out of here and gently start lowering down the knuckle. As we do, let's pay attention to the axle coming out of the wheel bearing right along here. We just want to make sure we push this through so we do not damage the axle while we continue. Use a 21mm to remove the outer tie rod end nut and then dislodge the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle. Let's continue on with a hammer. Cause a little bit of vibration right along the knuckle, being extremely careful not to damage the outer tie rod end stud or the brakes. At this point, we can start removing the 24mm lower ball joint mounting nut. While we remove this, keep in mind, there's nothing holding the knuckle to the vehicle aside from this one nut. So once we get it loose, be very aware that this does not fall down and potentially hurt you. Once you have that off of there, go ahead and put it back on a couple threads. We'll continue on by dislodging the steering knuckle from the lower ball joint. Let's continue with a hammer again. We're going to cause some vibration in this area, and then hopefully it'll dislodge the knuckle from the ball joint. We'll use a pickle fork to start dislodging this. Come right in between the ball joint and the steering knuckle. Use our hammer, give it a couple bonks to break it free. Grab onto that steering knuckle, lift it up, remove that lower ball joint nut, and now we can remove the steering knuckle from the vehicle. The next thing I always like to do is inspect and tie up my axle so it's not hanging down. We'll continue on to the lower sway bar link mounting point, right underneath the lower control arm. To remove this 18mm nut, we'll use some locking pliers right up along the top area here to hold the stud of the sway bar link in place. 18mm for the nut. We can set this aside. Remove your pliers. Once that's out of there, you're going to find that you cannot remove the sway bar link from the lower control arm at this point. We'll continue on to removing the lower bolt that holds the strut to the lower control arm. Along the front, you're going to find that you have a 24mm nut, and on the back side, which is the bolt head, a 21mm head. Hold the bolt head with the 21mm, come along the front to remove the nut. Make sure that that mounting bolt is freed up from the area. At this point, we'll pause, leaving that in there, and continue on to our inboard mounting bolts. Before we start removing these, it's important to note that these are an adjustment point for the alignment. It's a good idea to go ahead and mark these in some way. Typically a crayon or a marker will do just fine. We'll put a marking on the bolt and on the frame. Now we have this one up here marked. Let's continue and do the exact same thing to the rear. After you have those marked, we'll continue on with a 24mm wrench and a 24mm socket. To remove this, we're going to hold the front still while we remove the nut along the back side of each of these. While we're in here, we'll grab the back cam adjuster here. Give it a quick inspection. You can set that aside. Now we'll do the same for the rearward bolt. There's that one. Get the cam adjuster off of there. Now let's continue on to removing the bolt that holds the strut to the lower control arm. It's common to use a hammer and punch to do this. As you start removing this, keep in mind this could potentially come swinging down. Be as safe as possible. Now we can start swinging this down, pulling it away from the sway bar link. Now we can start moving this around and remove our inboard bolts. Now as we remove the last one, this is the last thing holding the control arm in the vehicle. Give that a little wiggle and pull it out of the frame. There it is, friends. Now we can get ready to install our brand new lower control arm. Let's put this in place in the frame and start in both of our mounting bolts. Continue on to installing each of these from the front towards the rear, making sure that you use the one from the front in the front. Good. We'll align this in a minute. Let's continue to do the same to the rear. Move along to swinging up the lower control arm. At this point, we need to align the sway bar link with its mounting hole. As we continue bringing it up, we're also going to line up the mounting hole on the bottom of the strut with the mounting hole on the control arm itself. We'll slide the mounting bolt through from the rear towards the front. Let's take our rearward alignment cams and put those onto the mounting bolts. When you do this, they should fit on only one way. Once you have it on there, you want to make sure that it's sitting inside the grooves on the frame. If it looks like it's hanging off or up against it, it's important to make sure that you use your 24mm wrench on the bolt side. You can go ahead and pivot this around a little bit until it fits in directly against the frame. Once you have it on there, we'll continue on to starting on each of the mounting nuts. You don't need to tighten these yet. We'll do the same on the rear. Double check to make sure that one's in the frame as well. Once you have both of those bolts started in, we're going to continue on by safely applying a little bit of pressure underneath the lower control arm. We want to try to bring this up just to the original ride height position, as if the vehicle's weight was on the ground. At this point, we're clear to start tightening our adjustment cam bolts. Before you do, though, it's important to make sure that you align your markings as you had removed them originally. To do that, we'll use our 24mm wrench and turn this accordingly, making sure that it's still sitting inside of the grooves of the frame on both sides before you try to tighten it. Once you have the forward one in position, make your way to the back side and tighten that mounting nut. We'll hold this still with our wrench to do so. Double check that marking to make sure it's still where it needs to be, and do the same thing to the rearward cam bolt. Let's torque each of these to 110 foot-pounds. Now we can make our way to the lower strut bolt, start on the nut, snug it up, and then torque that to 155 foot-pounds. Move along to your 18mm sway bar link nut, snug it up, torque it to 45 foot-pounds. Remove the support from underneath your lower control arm. Now we can start lowering that axle down. We'll remove our strap. It's a good idea to use some copper never sees on the splines of the axle, not necessarily the threaded area. Before we grab onto that knuckle and get ready to install it, you'll find for the mounting nut, on one side it has these 3 little tabs. Those are the locking tabs. That should be facing down. Looking at the other side, it's just a regular plain old nut. This would be facing up towards the ball joint. With that said, let's grab the knuckle, start sliding it into place. Now it's time to install the knuckle onto here. As we do so, we're going to come at an angle. We want to make sure that we align the ball joint stud with the bottom hole on the knuckle, and also start sliding the shaft of the axle through the rear side of that wheel bearing. Now we can bring this up into place and put on our ball joint nut. The next thing we'll do is start pushing the axle the rest of the way through the bearing. You can grab the axle from the backside, give it a little wiggle to slide it into place. We'll bring this up and start aligning our upper ball joint. To start bringing this knuckle up a little further, let's snug the lower ball joint nut. Use a 24mm for this. Let's get this aligned. Swing the control arm down so we can start in the upper ball joint nut. Now we can torque the lower ball joint nut to 95 foot-pounds. Let's move along to the upper ball joint nut. We'll use a 21mm socket for this. Snug it and torque it to 70 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, you want to pay attention to the slot on the nut. Make sure it aligns with the hole in the ball joint. If it doesn't, continue tightening that nut until the very next slot does. Take that cotter pin, slide it through, pin it over. Align your outer tie rod end, slide it into place, start on the 21mm nut, snug it up. Torque that to 80 foot-pounds. Let's move along to the brake caliper. We'll slide it in position over the rotor, align our 2 mounting bolt holes, and start in each of those 21mm headed bolts. Now we can snug them up and torque them to 130 foot-pounds. Now we can make our way to the ABS wire. Press that in, listen for a click, make sure it's secured together. Now we'll continue by pressing this through the fender well from the backside out through the forward area. We can take this and put it in position. Press that down, make sure it's secure. Now it's time to reinstall the axle nut. You'll notice that I'm a lot closer to the ground for this, because as we start to tighten this, you'll find that this wants to spin on you. The reason why we're close to the ground is because you can use a long pry bar, carefully get in between your studs, making sure that you're not going to damage them anyway, and that'll hold this still while you continue. We'll put on the axle nut, start it on there by hand and snug it up. Once you have it snugged by hand, go ahead and torque it to 185 foot-pounds. Let's remove the lug nut and the spacer from this area. Let's get our wheel on here. Start on all 5 of your 22mm lug nuts, bottom them out. Once you have those snug, get the wheel safely back down on the ground. We'll continue on to torquing each of the lug nuts to 140 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we've got the truck back together. At this point, go ahead and hop inside the passenger compartment, pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Take your vehicle for a road test, make sure you don't have an ABS light and no funny noises. After that, go ahead and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.